Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending tonight's Research Tuesdays event, the first one of the year, Preserving Biodiversity. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. My name is Olivia Bellis and I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Biomedicine here at the University of Adelaide. Tonight we're here because biodiversity loss is a crisis we can't ignore. It weakens our ecosystem's resilience to climate change, fuels natural disasters, and enables invasive species to drive native mammals to extinction. Tonight we're here to answer the question, how do we best control these invasive species? And how can science advances help? Our presenter tonight is Professor Andrew Lowe, the Director of the University's Environment Institute. He has also served as the Head of Science in the South Australian Department of Environment, Acting Director of the South Australian Museum, and Science Director for the Fight Food Waste CRC, amongst other positions. After his 20-minute presentation, Professor Lowe will then host a 20-minute panel with fellow biodiversity experts at the university, Professor Paul Thomas, Professor Michelle Waycott, and Dr. Adam Toombs. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lowe to the stage.
Okay, thanks so much, Olivia. And thank you for joining us all on this really warm day. I'm appreciative of the efforts that you've made to come out. We've probably got a few more people joining us online today because of the heat. At least it's nice and cool in here, so a bit of respite from the heat. So I wanted to talk about some of the biodiversity crisis, but also some of those solutions to the crisis. When we consider issues around particularly the extinction of species, we often think about some of those mega extinctions that went on within the history of the world, perhaps most famously the KT boundary for the extinction of the dinosaurs. But when we, just for context, when we look back over the history of the Earth, we've had 5 major extinction events where we've had somewhere in excess of 50% of all life on Earth has been sent to extinction over a period of time. And some of the reasons for that are due to meteorite impacts, large-scale volcanic eruptions, but they tend to set off cascades of climatic change and very rapid change, and many of those species can't respond, don't have enough resilience to adapt and change quickly enough. But often those extinction events actually take thousands or hundreds of thousands of years to take effect, with species going extinct over that kind of time period. Now, we are in potentially, sorry, let me just try this a bit more. We are potentially in the 6th extinction phase. We have named the current period the Anthropocene, recognizing the overwhelming influence that humans are having on our planet and on our environment. But also the levels of extinction are now starting to rise very quickly. They're still not at the levels of some of those major extinction events, but we've only really been at it 300 years. And the rate of extinction today is the fastest rate of extinction in the history of the Earth, if you take the number of extinctions divided by the time period. So we should be very worried about what's going on with our biodiversity and with our environment. If we look at the reasons that species go extinct, there are several reasons. If you clear the habitat they live in, if you over-exploit those species, illegal wildlife trade, Unsustainable fire regimes is a particular problem here within Australia. Also the introduction of invasive species and now climate change to add to that. Often pollution is added in there as well, particularly for aquatic species. So let's have a look. Let's have a look at the actual data. So how many species have gone extinct here in Australia in recent times? So since colonisation. It's quite a good paper that's published by John Wanowski. It's about 100 species that we can find good evidence for that have gone extinct in the last 200 years. Includes plants, mammals, invertebrates, birds, reptiles, fish, and a protist. So this tally represents about 6 to 10% of the world's post-1500 recognised extinctions. So it's quite a big proportion of the recent global extinctions. And the actual number is likely to be far higher, for insects and arthropods. We've probably only described about 15 to 20% of those. So there are many species that we don't know, and some of those will have gone extinct as well in this time period. So it's an underestimate. But mammals have suffered the highest proportional rate of extinction. So that's what we know for the Australian biota. And I just thought I'd list all the species, all 100 species that have gone extinct. The magnificent spider orchid. There's a number of gastric brooding frogs which went extinct. Number of birds, the Tasman starling, but then a big group of mammal species. Down at the bottom, the thylacine and a number of wallabies, stick-necked rats are species that have gone under. So what caused those extinctions? And or what can we learn from those extinctions? Species restricted to islands have done very poorly. However, even wide-ranging species on the continent have also gone extinct, except in the northern monsoonal area. Extinctions are not a thing of the past. They're still ongoing today and continuing at the same pace. And the main causes of extinction for mammals is introduced species. So it's the invasive species here in Australia that have directly result in the extinction of those species, particularly the introduction of cats and foxes. In plants are particularly linked to habitat loss and the area that's available for habitat. Frogs, diseases that have been introduced, again, form of invasive species. Reptiles, snakes, so an invasive species. And now climate change is adding to the cocktail of pressures on our native species, with at least one recent extinction attributable in part to climatic change. So Australia is particularly vulnerable to invasive species. Its geographic isolation, its unique ecosystems, and the fact that it's been isolated from a number of these invasive species for a very long time makes it particularly vulnerable. And the high level of human activity, both clearance and introduction of species, but also shipping and changing our habitat. So all of these have contributed to the fact that Australia is particularly sensitive to species. And when we look at the load of the introduction of invasive species, the cost of the control of those invasive species is going up almost exponentially over time. And current estimates are about $20 billion per year is spent on the control of these species, just over 20 billion. Particularly cats, rabbits, ants, and other species. So not only do they drive species to extinction, but also particularly in terms of agricultural loss, they have a very high impact. And then the cost of the control of those animals is substantial. Okay, and we've got a number of different methods. We've got a number of different methods in our arsenal that we can use to actually either prevent the spread or help with the control of these invasive species. Some of the mechanical or chemical methods, and you've probably all heard of biological control, particularly in the case of rabbits, calicivirus and myxomatosis. Education plays a key part. But perhaps more than at any other time, stopping the importation of invasive species will help stop future environmental catastrophes. So it's really useful when we're thinking about solutions and the way that invasive species go to think of it in this invasion curve. We really want to stop invasive species and prevent invasive species coming to Australia. When they do come, when they're here in small numbers, we want to jump on top of them and eradicate them quickly. We want to contain any species that do become established, and then if they do get more broadly established, then we're going to try and control those. And we're going to come back to that in the Q&A for today's session. Now, I'm not sure if anybody in the audience has seen this, but we had a lot of fun over the last 15 months actually writing some of the script. Myself and Phil Cassie helped write the script for the 6-part episode. Now, we had a bit of fun because clearly we're not recommending everybody eats invasive species. Did you get that? It's a way to kind of look at what has been, I think, quite a difficult debate, and it's also a debate where society's kind of switched off. We spent so much money on invasive species, and they're still with us. Let's have a go at just refreshing some of the debate. I'll just quickly plug
Australia, famous for its incredible landscapes and its iconic animals.
Oh, hello, babe.
Unfortunately, our native animals are under attack from the invasive species brought here by our colonial ancestors. They're causing an environmental catastrophe, driving some of our most unique plants and animals to the brink of extinction.
We were talking about 3 billion animals dying just from cats.
3 billion.
Australia is the home of the world's largest wild camel population.
Carp make up 90% of the biomass of everything in here.
We cannot eradicate some of the feral animals that have taken over.
But what if we could help? By reimagining this problem as a tasty solution. So, at a provocative art museum, I'll work with an artist and curator.
In some cases, you could and should eat it into eradication.
And a chef.
It's really exciting to be using these invasive ingredients that we have.
To see if we can turn Australia's most destructive invaders into high cuisine.
You can taste the carp.
Oh, God!
Along the way, we'll challenge the cultural perceptions that influence why we eat one animal and not another.
Would you eat carp?
Yes. No.
Yes. No, yes.
Why would you eat a carp?
Eating cane toads? Are you completely mad?
And we'll create 6 incredible feasts that ask whether we humans can help save Australia, one forkful at a time.
Oh, it's like a monster.
Territory teriyaki cane toads.
How did you get into the eating of cane toad, and how do you do it without dying?
Oh!
Really, it's a matter of perception, and we're going to challenge that.
I mean, that is as succulent as it gets.
It looks so good.
Dinner is about to be served.
Fucking unreal.
Welcome to Eat the Invaders.
Eating invasive species, probably somewhere to the right-hand side. A lot of these species are very abundant. Why not utilise the protein source while we are controlling them using other scientific methods? And so what I want to do today is actually ask the panel about some of the new science and new science methods that we're developing and can help really control, contain and prevent invasive species coming here to Australia. So first, I'd like to invite Michelle Waycott, Chief Botanist of the Botanic Gardens State Herbarium of South Australia and with the Department for Environment and Heritage. Thank you, Michelle. Professor Paul Thomas, who leads the Genome Editing Programme and Essay Genome Editing Facility at the University of Adelaide and SAMRI. And Dr. Adam Toombs, Postdoc Fellow in the Combating Wildlife and Environmental Crime Hub. Okay, so if we use the invasion curve as our... Did I sit on something? No, it's all good. If we use the invasion curve. So Michelle, I'm going to come to you first. So tell us a bit about... Hang on. Oh, yeah. Tell us a bit about the work you do in the herbarium, particularly in relation to jumping on those first invasive species. And of course, you deal more with plants, don't you, rather than animals?
Almost exclusively to do with plants, although sometimes animals like to move our non-native species around. At the State Herbarium, we have an active program that supports early detection or even the detection of species that are out of place and what we refer to as naturalised plants. And that's where a plant that is in a place where we haven't expected it to be previously is found. That's a bit garbly, right? But it's actually quite challenging. There's a whole range of native Australian plants that occur across Australia, but outside of what we would call their natural range. South Australia has over 1,600 taxa or species, mostly of naturalised plants. What that means is about a third of our flora is not where it should be naturally. That's about the highest in the country, which is a little bit shocking, but probably not surprising given the land clearing of South Australia and the fact we're at this nexus between the east and the west and the north, and we have a big port. So what we try to do is our weeds botanist, Chris Brodie, who works very closely with regional staff and staff from PIRSA, tries to find species that we haven't found in the state before. And we've had over 250 new species detected in South Australia since 2009. 250. And that's in the wild, that's not in the bush. We then essentially try to work with regional staff and sometimes landholders to get on top of the introduction, and then they can roll out local solutions. And we also try to work with PIRSA biosecurity team who have more of a interventionist approach to removing invasives. So it's about finding them, recognising that they are not there naturally, and getting on top of why they might be there. So, yeah.
So have you managed to stop those 250?
No. No, very few of those will have been stopped because quite often they're already quite widespread before people collect them and or you're in the landscape. Then you have the massive problems of weeds like bufflegrass, which has completely changed very large swathes of our landscape, and it's all pervasive now. They're very hard to manage. Yeah. Interestingly, there's a new recognition of fungal invasive species. For example, the death cap fungus. Very rarely seen more than a decade ago. Now we're seeing it increasing in numbers each year, and because it's a health risk to mammals and humans, We actually have one of our staff who answers calls from the medical kind of hotlines to try to help prevent illness and death.
Okay, so Paul, we're being overwhelmed by, there's a tsunami of invasive species washing over Australia and South Australia. That wouldn't be too dramatic, would it, Michelle? No. You work in the genomics area. How can your science help with the eradication of or at least suppression of these species once they become established?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. It's a really, in some ways, it's a very highly motivating problem to be working on. And my background's really in the realms of genetics, as you said, and we use a fairly new technology called CRISPR genome editing. Perhaps if some of you were here late last year, you would have heard me speak about it in a different context. But essentially, this is a way of altering the very stuff of life of DNA, and it's enabled us to work on technologies that, or develop technologies that really were just a pipe dream 20 years ago, but now we can consider developing them in the laboratory to perhaps one day deploy them for this, very difficult issue. So specifically, it's called gene drive technology or genetic biocontrol, and it's being worked on by us here in Australia, mostly in the context of mammals, but also internationally in the context of insects. So it can be used in a wide range of invasive species. And the idea is that you kind of use these so-called gene drives. I'll explain what they are in a moment, but they're a way of bending the normal rules of genetic inheritance. So what normally happens in genetics is there's a 50-50 probability, if you like, a heads or a tails, that a particular gene will be passed on. Gene drives bend these rules, and in the most extreme case, they are always passed on by the individual that carries them to the next generation. So it's like having a coin with two heads. They always get passed on, which means that they can spread quite rapidly through a population. So you might think that's a very strange sort of type of a gene, and in fact they occur in nature. We know that, and we can also synthesize them in a laboratory to make a form that we could then use in theory to not only spread through a target invasive species, but also to suppress that species. So essentially what we're doing in the lab is to really embark on a long-term project, which is to try and develop this technology. Initially we're using mice as our model species to start with. We know a lot about the way the mouse genes work, so we have a good sort of a head start. And also we know a lot about sort of how to change the mouse genome. But our long-term goals are probably more around rabbits, rats, and even perhaps cats and foxes. Okay. Because the idea here is that the advantage of gene drives is that you could have an impact on a whole population with relatively few individuals. It doesn't involve any toxins, so it's quite a humane form of control. Essentially what you do is you're spreading infertility through a population. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but the gene drive spreads, and then when it gets to saturation, you can make the individuals infertile. So it's kind of got a lot of potential, but it's also an awful lot of development that needs to take place. So we're starting with mice, as I said, but we certainly have eye on other target invasive species. And I guess the last thing I would say is that to try and get a sense of how well this technology could work, we do a lot of modelling in the lab as well. So we work at the University of Adelaide, also at SAMRI, and work with a team here, Phil Cassie, who couldn't be here, but Adam is part of that team. And we model the effect of these species using really some state-of-the-art modelling. So it involves pretty high-end molecular biology in facilities, also state-of-the-art modelling, and also critically stakeholder engagement as well, because we want to understand it's quite an impactful but new technology. We want to understand people's views about it, and that's, I think, a big part of what we're here for tonight too. So thanks.
So a potential silver bullet there that works well on the computer, but is being trialled within the labs. And you've presumably had some quite good trials with mice trials for the transmission of the gene drive and potential lethality of the gene that's involved.
Yep. So we were the first to develop a proof of concept gene drive for any mammal, and it happened to be mice. So what we did in this case was to leverage one of the natural gene drives and then turned it into something in a laboratory setting that could we could do proof of concept to show that it could cause infertility in females. That's great, but what we need now is to do trials that involve a free breeding population, which becomes a very expensive exercise. But to give you a sense of the modelling, we showed that in a context of an island population where rodents really are a big problem, we could eliminate the population, even halve it within a number of years by deploying just about less than 1% of the original
So you
species.
target an island and try that out.
Yep.
And you've had some promise of funding as well to trial this, have you?
We have. I can't make any formal announcements tonight, but we are working very closely.
It's hopeful.
It's hopeful with the federal initiative to really put some significant dollars into this area of research.
Yep.
Not only to do the lab development, but to do the modelling, to do the stakeholder engagement, effectively the whole package, because we see this as a very broad project that has many aspects to it, and we need to, as I said, engage the community as much as do the gene drive development.
Yeah. So with potential solution there, but Adam, surely it's better if they don't even come to Australia in the first place, right? So how do we secure our borders and stop new invasive species coming into Australia?
Yeah, so the y-axis on this figure up here says area affected on the left-hand side, but management costs on the right. And so you'll see that the cheapest way to deal with invasives is to prevent their initial spread in the first place, while also understanding that we have this legacy impact of things that are already here, and we also need to deal with those. We need to stop the future generation of new invasive species. And so to do that, we need to have a better understanding of what the pathways are that are bringing non-native species to Australian shores. Some of that is just a consequence of how globalized we are. Geckos that end up smuggled, that end up as stowaways on cargo containers and that sort of thing. And there's ways that we can model transport pathways and be more prepared for the sort of species that are coming in accidentally. What our research in particular is focusing on is the deliberate importation of non-native species. So particularly for the exotic pet trade, there is a surprising and ever-increasing diversity of alien species, some of which are invasive species, that people are bringing into the country either legally or illegally and are keeping as exotic pets. Maybe it's a companion animal or it just looks pretty in a tank. And there's a sort of existing domestic trade within Australia. If they stay in captivity, that's not the biggest problem in the world, but what's happening is that pets are escaping into the wild. Maybe people don't contain them or have enough information to contain them properly, or people decide that this tiny fish that they bought for $2 that they thought was going to stay that size is actually 50 times the size and they don't have enough space for it, so they deliberately release it into the wild, thinking that they're doing the right thing for that animal, but what they're actually doing is accelerating the spread of an invasive species. So we're trying to get a better understanding of what those species are, what their potential impacts are. In order to do that, we are mainly monitoring the online trade of exotic pets, which is happening quite openly and freely, so it makes it very, very easy for us to monitor. We're not doing it manually. We're using sort of automated web scraping tools to be across multiple platforms at once to see what is being traded across Australia. And the results are quite concerning. So
give us some results. How many invasive species are coming, or potentially invasives, are coming in via the pet trade routes?
In terms of potentially invasives, because you've got to remember a lot of these things haven't had a chance to spread and prove their invasiveness yet.
We don't know.
There's a lot of unknowns.
Yeah.
Among fish species alone, there's about 550 non-native species being traded in Australia right now, of which about 280 are not legal to import. So their presence here is interesting, to say the least.
So hang on, I could just go onto the web somewhere. We won't name any sites, but a site, and I can look, and if I fancy bringing a fish in, it'll be sent over, and I can receive it. No problem.
Yeah.
And there's no kinds of controls.
There are coarse controls, but our importation regulations when it comes to things like fish sometimes only list things not at the species level. Sometimes it's at the genus level or the family level, so kind of a coarse level. And so you only have to label an incoming commodity as that sort of higher level.
Yeah.
So you can label something as, the cichlid family, and it could be a very invasive or highly illegal species, but it's just labeled like that.
Yeah.
So, that, and the sorts of information that we're gathering, we try to feed that back into policy as well. So we try to point out these discrepancies to government and say, hey, maybe we need to change the way that we monitor what we're importing. And in the meantime, here are the existing problems that we're not really dealing with.
So you do have the tools really to prevent that, or at least the tools to screen those trade routes that are bringing those species in via pets. And pet areas. Whether there's enough control at the borders to be able to help with that is probably the next stage.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't trust your information.
Yeah. Well, that's not a technology issue. It's a science getting listened to issue. So that's a whole different ballgame. But it's not my area of expertise. But there's some really interesting work being done in terms of environmental DNA and sampling of import commodities. There's some really interesting stuff. Sampling the air and the dust in cargo containers to identify what's in there if there are high risk invasive species, sampling bodies of water from imported fish to see what species are actually in there and does that match what the importers labeled them as. So it's a really interesting space that I think our ability to regulate that is going to improve pretty quickly, but it needs to because we've got a lot of stuff coming in.
Yep, great. So I'm just going to quickly ask you each a question and then we're going to go to the Q&A for the audience. So, Michelle, unfortunately you haven't had time to think about the answer, but I think what do you think is the number one priority to help control invasive species? Many of these species are probably going to be with us forever, so what is the number one priority? And which invasive species would you serve for dinner?
First of all, the priority is to prevent them coming in, absolutely. And then once they're here, I think we need to be very aware that how they occupy the landscape, both the native, bushland, for example, as well as our urban areas, is very dependent on the kinds of biological characters they have. So understanding how they survive and what might lead to them being able to survive longer or preventing them from surviving is a really critical thing. And we've got literally tens of thousands of introduced species in the country that are of concern, and that's without counting the insects, and we really need to understand them better. Which ones would I eat? I do like me a cane-toed leg.
Yeah,
I do. After living in North Queensland for many years.
You get a taste for it, right?
Yeah.
Paul, what would be your priority? And what would you have for dinner? What would be your priority to help control the invasive species? What do you think is the number one thing that we should be doing, not only as scientists, but as a country? Well, of course, funding gene drive.
You read my mind. I think doing more of the same isn't really working. I think from the recent report, it was something like the cost of invasive species since 1970 has doubled every decade or more. Yeah. So clearly what we're doing is not working. So I actually do think that investing in some form of technologies, I would include gene drive in that, but perhaps others as well. There needs to be some sort of circuit breaker approach to get us over this, inexorable path towards further extinctions. Which one would I have for dinner? I haven't thought about this. Maybe rabbit. Yeah. Rabbit. I think Australians used to eat a lot of rabbit.
Used to eat a lot of rabbit, yeah.
Yeah. That would be the one I'd go for. I'm not sure I'm brave enough to take on the cane toast.
We're going to see rabbit resurgence, I'm sure. And Adam, just a priority for you in terms of invasive species control, and yes, supper.
Sounds good. I've been thinking about it the whole time. I think in terms of the management of invasive species, particularly with the way we regulate things, we need to have a more proactive mindset rather than reactive. We often wait until there is evidence that a non-native species is a problem, and then we start implementing laws, regulations, and policy to control it, by which point it's probably about halfway down that graph and becoming increasingly more expensive as we go. Yeah. So I think where it's sensible to do so, and when it's not prohibiting the way people normally go about their lives or the way industry normally operates, we shouldn't be permitting things to be imported into the country unless they've already undergone some sort of risk assessment screening. So in other words, having a positive list approach where the sorts of things we can bring in and the sorts of things we can do are approved based on evidence, rather than a negative list approach where we only specify the things that can't come in once they're already a troublemaker.
Yep.
Oh, and the easy answer that first came to my head was deer, because venison is delicious, and I'm surprised we don't eat more of it. I keep telling myself to eat more of it as I become increasingly more aware of the problem of feral deer, particularly on the East Coast. But I've also never tried cane toad and would be very curious to find out if that trumps venison.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the other thing, Adam, to emphasise is if you do have a pet fish, do not release it or any reptiles or anything into the wild. Yeah. Kill it first.
Absolutely.
Right.
And, you know,
absolutely, any pet, do not release them.
Under any circumstances, even if it's native, right? Because it might not be native to the area that you're releasing it.
Yeah.
You know, we have introduced population of eastern water dragons in the Adelaide Hills now. We have rainbow lorikeets in Tasmania and Western Australia. Yep. So it's not even the things that are considered a non-native species outside of the jurisdiction of Australia that are a problem. It's also stuff within it. So responsible pet ownership would take care of a lot of these problems with respect to that pathway of invasive species. Yeah.
And keeping your cat indoors at night. You know, there are some simple things that are being promoted that councils are taking up that can really help with both the release and the impact of invasive species. But Olivia, I think we've used up our time now as a panel, so I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Andy, Paul, Michelle, and Adam. So we're now like to open up questions from the audience, but I will begin with a pre-submitted question. And that is, what's your assessment of South Australia's draft biodiversity bill and how might it be improved? Not sure who wants to answer that one first.
I got dobbed in for this because through my role in the State Herbarium, we consulted on the development of the draft. I think there are some really excellent components to the bill, and it's an essential regulation which has been a big gap for South Australia for some time. I think greater understanding of the implications of how our biodiversity is assessed and the pathways to protecting it need to be a bit clearer in the Act. I think that's where I see a bit of a gap right now. I'm certainly getting lots of calls from the community, both technical and the general public, about some of the wording, particularly to do with the definition of a native plant species, which we'll be making some recommendations about. But I think the general principle that we should be trying to protect our native species in our wild places is fundamentally built into the legislation draft, and the tools to manage it are being built into it. The second part of it is we have a number of obligations internationally around recognising traditional knowledge and Indigenous intellectual property, and I think whether that's part of this Biodiversity Act or additional legislation, there needs to be a greater acknowledgement of that to certainly align us with the global community in that space.
Great, thank you. Now, was there anyone in the audience that had a question for our panel? Okay, quite a you. We're just going to come down with the microphone now. There's a couple just over here.
Thank you for an excellent talk. However, it didn't actually address what I was expecting from the title, which was biodiversity loss. My husband and I have had 100 acres out at Rockley for the last 16 years, and 3 things are contributing to the biodiversity loss there. The first one is loss of insects, which I presume is due to pesticides used by farmers. We used to have 100 or 150 swallows come and roost every night under our veranda. Now we see none. Another problem is kangaroos, which has been caused by the increase in agriculture, which provided a very good environment for kangaroos. We used to see them occasionally. Now we see mobs of 50. They're knocking down tree guards, and with the drought, they're eating every species they can possibly get their teeth into. Some they've never tackled before. And the third problem is that the local council, which is Murray Bridge, is allowing people to put down bores much further up the hill from us, a few kilometres away. It's dropped the water table, so there's no longer any water in Long Gully Creek over dry spells, nor in our water holes. I'd like to have your comments, please.
I'm happy to take that one. Preserving biodiversity is a very big topic, and so for the public presentation tonight, we selected to focus on invasive species. As you'll probably appreciate, each of those topics that you've mentioned are huge, and we could spend a couple of hours on each of those. Just very briefly, I think some of the main problems here in Australia are around habitat clearance, and that has certainly, if you drive then plant species to extinction, you bring in invasive species, you're knocking those native mammals back, then the insects are suffering as well. So, and then you add on top of that an insecticide application, and then you get common species that fill the gap. So that's why you get overabundant native species also filling the gap together with invasive species. Now what that indicates is that system is out of balance. So if there is enough opportunity, then restoration of native habitat is one of the best ways to do that, and there are opportunities through things like carbon markets and hopefully the new nature repair bill, but for that you will need the water and access to water for the sites. I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards about strategies that could be implemented.
Hello, and thank you. It was very interesting what you've all said. I guess for me, this is certainly not my area, but I have a great passion and interest in it. I'm just concerned that we've known about these problems for such a long time. Invasive species, increased, importation illegally and legally. Maybe the genome area not so, and that sounds absolutely wonderful. I'm just wondering, I'd really like to hear what have been the barriers to why it seems to me that things are getting worse, especially with the example we've just heard in Rockley. It seems that exponentially there seem to be problems as well with these species increasing with plagues and the plant kingdom as well. I just wondered, what are the barriers? Is it a policy, law thing, or is it something that maybe Adam referred to about believing in science or funding? I hope that's not too big a question for you.
Do you want to have a go? And then, yeah.
I think some of those questions are built around the fact that our policy for biodiversity, and not that long ago it was the no species loss legislation, and then the NRM Act, and now we have the Biodiversity Act. All of these policies, legislation and tools all would require a concerted, coordinated aligned, cross-sector, cross-community action to make it work. And it's like it's like recycling or the introduction of unhealthy food. All of these things, there's an element of it that people, they just want to get on with what they like to do. So what tools could we apply to make people actually do the right thing all the time, not just some of the time? So releasing pets into the environment so we end up with more cats out bush is a huge issue. People still want to do that, even with the current rules around pet sterilisation and the number of pets people have. People still end up with, litters that they, throw away. So all of these things that make a lot of sense and are totally logical, and the science is accepted and adopted, it is in legislation, it is against the law to do those things, people still do it. So there's the link between the evidence base, people's willingness to participate in action, and the environmental outcome. We have to be able to adopt it socially more widely. Now, there's a couple of things that can encourage that, and Andy gave a good example of the, eat your invader. But there's a whole range of things that can do that. I think the legislative tools we have aren't bad. I think the application of them is challenged by people's behaviour and our societal acceptance that we don't always have to do it. We can pick and choose in some ways. And I'm being a little harsh on my fellow citizens here, but that's what we see happening with our science and with our data and with our evidence. So I think that's, yeah.
And I think I also sit on the Hills and Fluvial Landscape Board. So the landscape boards took over from the NRM boards. They're community-led organisations that are supposed to help equip communities with the tools to help control some of the worst environmental ills. I think for the board with the Hills and Fluvial, we've got down to the situation of these are our key nature assets that are in the landscape. How do we protect those? Now, there is substantial investment at the moment to remove all deer from South Australia. There's been a shooting program that's been underway for 2 to 3 years. More than, I think they've taken out 40,000 animals. They're more than halfway to the eradication of deer. They've reduced significantly the eradication the numbers of goats within that region as well. And the ripple effect is now being taken up by other landscape boards. And one of the important things is that they have the legislative authority to go onto properties and shoot deer and goats. And those people that harbour those animals can't do that legally. There's a process, but these kind of authorities have that. But they don't use the stick all the time. They use the carrot. They work with community groups to get action groups together. And I think it's what you're talking about, it's that coordinated effect. I work in the environmental area. I've worked here for 20 odd years here in South Australia. I haven't lost hope with things because I do see those types of instruments, once they're coordinated, can be really effective. And also they really give an effective route for the application of new technologies to be applied on top of those community-led areas as well. And also I think we are seeing new investment potentially coming into the environment as well. I think we could have solved some of the invasive species problems through clear investment earlier on, and that didn't come for various reasons. Much of that was political. But with the new nature finance and linking with international markets, and you've got the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, where all large companies at the moment voluntarily disclose their nature impacting activities, but next year it's likely to be mandatory. I think we're seeing some really interesting shifts globally in support of nature.
Can I just quickly add to the sort of the concept of barriers? So just to give a sort of a perspective from earlier in the pipeline, so before something is a recognized pest and you're trying to get it recognized as a pest, when I first started doing research, I had this very naive view that if you do the science well and you report it well and you put a lot of effort into communicating outwardly, it will lead to change being implemented. And sometimes that's true, but what I had to learn begrudgingly is that science is just one of the many voices that government have to listen to and policymakers have to listen to. So, for example, when something is beneficial to an industry, when something is beneficial to the general public, and you as a scientist are saying we should not do that thing, that's a very difficult thing for a politician to hear, for a policymaker to hear. It takes a lot of courage to make a change that may upset your constituents or a particular lobby group. So, for example, with what we do, when it comes to non-native reptiles being imported as pets across the country, completely illegal. Very clear-cut fines. You could be arrested if you have a lot of them. Very clear. When it comes to ornamental fish, there's hundreds and hundreds of species that you can legally import. And I remember when I was combing through the regulations, I'm like, where's this discrepancy coming from? Invasive risk doesn't just stop with reptiles, and then, why are we not policing these things uniformly? And the real answer is that because when we made the law that regulates these imports in the early 80s, there was already an existing ornamental fish lobby group. And there was an ornamental fish industry because species were already brought in prior to these laws and people wanted to keep what they already had. And so then the government was like, okay, well, you can keep what you already have, even though it might be invasive. And there wasn't a large reptile lobby group because it's a younger sort of hobby and industry. And so it was the political context that was driving a quite dramatically different form of management. And that legacy exists to this day. And it bleeds into the invasion risk. So it's a difficult reality to admit that science isn't the only thing being considered, but not in a fatalistic way. It just means that we have to be as rigorous and as loud a voice to counteract the other voices that are going into the decision making.
Can I just add, one of the things I learned coming out of a research experience and into working within government and alongside government was there's often points in that process that can be influenced if people are aware of that's where the point in the process is. And becoming aware of how, for example, to get an invasive species recognised in the state is a really useful thing if you're concerned about that to do. There's a number of pathways to do it, but it's not something that's generally thought about as something you have to do. Of course, this thing suddenly is everywhere. It's invaded us, but there's actually several steps that have to be completed before it can be acted on by governments and regulators, and therefore trigger a response that allows you to actually get rid of it. So there's often quite reasonable reasons why that process is in place, but if you don't know about it and you can't be informed by it and inform it, then you're stuck, and that's often where we all get trapped.
We have time for one more quick question, and then I think if our lovely researchers are willing to stay after, if you have questions after, you can pop up for a few minutes. But here's our last question of the night.
Thank you. That was great. I've really enjoyed that. And I just wanted to say that camel is by far the most tasty of any of those invasive species. And I would happily buy it if somebody would sell it. I was very worried that you're thinking the next extinction event was people. And I wanted to ask, do you think we could change that around? And how many million years could we possibly last? And could we possibly eradicate politicians?
So there's a few questions there, but answer what you can. Thank you.
I'm happy to have a go. I think I might leave the politician question because we are on camera. Look, we clearly need nature to live as a society and as people. I think there are now some clear priorities globally around how much nature we need within our landscapes. And the Montreal Kunming target is for 30% of our landscape to be natural, and then the other 70% to be urban production areas. But you really need about 30% of the landscape to maintain biodiversity, you need to maintain the ecosystem services, and you need to do something in addition to that to stop climate change. So I think if we get behind those types of targets, we can save nature and ourselves into the bargain. We are seeing some very positive signs that is taking effect. In the Mount Lofty ranges here, we're down to 10 or 11% remnancy of native habitat. There is now a very large initiative to actually plant 20% habitat cover to recover the bird population within the hills. That's about 150,000 hectares, and SA Water, Forestry SA, DEW, the Landscape Board, and a number of large landholders in the hills are on board to actually initiate that project. It's been through about 1.5 years of planning, but there's also finance that's available from routes like carbon credits and also potentially nature credits and philanthropy to help drive that. So again, I think I'm probably an optimist, a naive optimist sometimes within the area, but I do see that these types of projects are possible. And also within the constituency of the hills and the Fluria, I see people out there that are doing good work. I see people like Tim Jarvis, who runs Forktree, John Farger, that runs Yundi. And these people are doing projects and they act as regional demonstrators and local demonstrators. They bring the communities together. John has pretty much single-handedly saved the Fluria swamps by encouraging neighbouring properties that have Fluria swamps on their property to get rid of Phragmites, which is a choking weed within the property, and then bring back those. So I think through these individuals, I think we can at least make not so bad the 6th mass extinction on Earth.
Great. Thanks everyone for your really good questions. I'd just like to finish now by thanking tonight's wonderful speaker and panellists, Professor Andrew Lowe, Professor Paul Thomas, Professor Michelle Waycott, and Dr. Adam Toombs. And thanks to you, our audience, and be sure to sign up to our mailing list to receive the latest information about Research Tuesdays related news. Thank you for tuning in for our first Research Tuesdays event of the year, and have a great night.